We interrupt this program to bring you special live coverage of the United Nations Security Council meeting on the crisis in Iran. Here now in our studio are Steve Bosch, Jeff Kamen, and David Schoenbrunn.
Good evening. The United Nations Security Council is gathering and preparing to go into formal session on the crisis in Iran, where it is expected that the first speaker will be American UN Ambassador Donald McHenry. Now, after that, we are informed speakers from Western Europe, most of them NATO allies of the United States, will make policy statements on behalf of their governments. The Security Council is expected to end with the American and Allied positions in tonight's opening session. Now, joining me with tonight's live coverage of that session is news analyst David Schoenbrunn. David, as we await the start of the session, any thoughts?
Well, one thought is that I'm glad to hear you say that we expect to hear these things because the agenda can change at the United Nations. Whatever happens, we'll endeavor to follow it for you and to clarify it for you. I was most impressed earlier today when the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Frank Church, made a statement saying that the United Nations itself is now on trial. We've been saying the same thing on this program for some days. The reason, I think, is really quite apparent. The challenge is not to the United States alone. The delegate of Iran is not even attending this session. He has snubbed the United Nations. Iran is guilty, or at least being charged with being guilty, of a violation of international law. And it simply doesn't even bother to defend itself. The leaders of Iran have already said that they won't accept orders from anybody, that they're going to put our hostages on trial unless the Shah is returned, which means they have already openly defied the United Nations. However, that defiance does not become a legal defiance until the United Nations actually gives them an order, and they refuse to follow that order. And that is really the purpose of the Security Council sessions that we're about to go through this weekend. It is expected, again expected, not sure, that this will end up with some kind of a resolution calling upon Iran to free the hostages. Now, Steve, if Iran does not do that, then legally, at last, she is in open defiance of the United Nations.
One thing I wanted to ask you, David, is there any precedent for this sort of thing in the United Nations?
Oh, yes.
Has this ever happened before?
Well, there is precedent for nations defying the United Nations. That has happened before. There's no precedent for what Iran has done. There's no precedent for a government actually condoning terrorism and refusing to protect diplomatic envoys. That is unique in all of human history. That hasn't happened. But the United Nations has been challenged a great many times, and it has risen to that challenge upon a number of occasions. This, however, seems to be the most serious because it is the most flagrant example, and because a great superpower, in fact the greatest, the United States, is the one that is at the bar of justice calling for justice. The United States, you see, is the most important supporter of the United Nations. We are not only the host government to the World Organization, but we actually pay more dues than anybody else. We are, in fact, a solid bulwark and have been from the beginning. But for the last 10 years or so, we have been treated rather shabbily. The United States is in the minority in the World Organization, and of course, there's no reason for us to complain about that. We are a minority in the population of the world. But at least, even as a minority, given our power, given our support, given the dues that we pay, and simply given ordinary justice, the United States has a right to demand more from the United Nations than it has been getting, and this is going to be the trial of strength for the UN.
Now, let me ask you this, David. The government of Iran, such as it is, continues to more and more isolate itself. I don't, from my own point of view, I don't understand how this isolation can help them. I mean, they are isolating themselves from the world.
Well, that's quite correct. If it helps them at all, according to most observers familiar with Iran and familiar with the Ayatollah Khomeini and his particular type of religious sect, they point out that in this Shiite sect, which is a minority sect of Islam, of the Muslim religion, particularly at this time of the year, in their particular holy day that they have been celebrating, there is a tendency to seek martyrdom. Now, when you're isolated, when you defy the greatest power in the world, the United States, when the rest of the world turns on you, you have achieved a form of martyrdom. Maybe what's being useful, Steve, if I may say so, is that it's helping keep the fervor of his revolution at fever pitch.
I think we should also make the distinction that I think a lot of people may have the impression that the people in Iran, the people of Iran, are Arabs, whereby they're not.
No, they're Persians. They are not an Arab people. I think we must make another distinction, which the President of the United States has already made and certainly bears constant repetition. And that is the United States, the people of the United States, the government of the United States have no quarrel with Islam. We have no quarrel with Muslims. We respect their religion, and we do not identify all of them with the Ayatollah Khomeini.
I believe we're about to begin the session. I thought I heard a gavel tap.
Well,
there's the Ambassador McHenry.
The 2175th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. Allow me, on behalf of the members of the Council, to express to Ambassador Palacio de Vizio, Permanent Representative of Bolivia to the United Nations, our deep appreciation for the successful and outstanding way in which, as President for the month of November, he presided over the Council's extremely difficult work last month. The agenda for this meeting is before the Council in document S Agenda 2175. Unless I hear any objection, I shall consider the agenda adopted. In accordance with the decision taken at the 2172nd meeting, I invite the representative of Sri Lanka to take the seat reserved for him at the side of the Council chamber. I should also like to inform members of the Council that I received letters from the representatives of Egypt and Liberia, in which they request to be invited to participate in the Council's discussion of the item on the agenda. In accordance with the usual practice, I propose, with the consent of the Council, to invite those representatives to participate in the discussion without the right to vote, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Charter and Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. There being no objection, it is so decided. I invite the representatives of Egypt and Liberia to take the seats reserved for them at the side of the Council chamber. I wish to inform the Council that the Chargé d'Affaires of the Permanent Mission of Iran to the United Nations, Mr. Jamal Shemirani, officially informed the outgoing President of the Council yesterday that, on instructions of his government, Iran does not intend to be present at this evening's meeting. The Security Council will now resume its consideration of the item on the agenda. I should like to draw the attention of members of the Council to the following documents which are before them. Document S13648, letter dated 26th of November 1979 from the Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General. Document S13659, telegram dated 27th of November 1979 from the Chairman of the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States addressed to the President of the Security Council. Document S13667, letter dated 30th November 1979 from the Permanent Representative of Guinea to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General, and document S13668, letter dated 30th November 1979 from the Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General. The first speaker inscribed on my list is the representative of the United States, to whom I give the floor.
Mr. President, 27 days ago, 63 Americans, as well as personnel of other nationalities, were seized when armed, disciplined group of demonstrators invaded the United States Embassy in Tehran. 18 of those captured have been released. At least 50 Americans remain captive. As with diplomats everywhere, the individuals who were taken hostage are entitled to the protection of the government of Iran by the most solemn commitment nations can give, the sovereign pledge of governments by treaty and international obligation. Governments, of course, retain the right to require that foreign diplomatic personnel leave their soil. But every standard of international behavior, whether established by practice, by ethics, by treaty, or by common humanity, supports the principle that the personnel of a diplomatic mission and diplomatic property are inviolate. Even in the darkest moments of relationships between countries, the security and well-being of diplomatic personnel has been respected. Iran asks that its grievances be heard and acted upon. Yet Iran and the authorities who speak for it are violating the most basic obligation of nations. They hold hostage the very people and whose job it is to facilitate communications, whose job it is to resolve differences and lead to understanding and agreement among nations. None of us, whatever our differences on other issues, can ignore the implications for all of us of this event. Nor can the world ignore that these diplomatic representatives are being held under degrading conditions. They are threatened, kept bound, isolated, not allowed to speak, denied mail. Even their whereabouts are uncertain. All of us at this table are also diplomatic representatives of our countries, charged with the same duties and protected by the same laws and rules of conduct as those now held captive in Tehran. It is for all of us to speak up, to demand their release, and to insist upon basic conditions of humanity for their care pending their release, including daily visitation by impartial observers. Many members of the United Nations, including some of the members of this council, have had ambassadors murdered, diplomatic personnel injured, embassy facilities destroyed. On each occasion, the delicate framework of the international community has been harmed, but efforts were made to heal the wounds. The situation in Tehran has a feature unlike other assaults on the diplomatic ties that bind our world. In Iran, the government itself defends the violence which holds diplomats hostage. Such a situation is intolerable. The United States insists that its diplomatic personnel be released and its diplomatic premises be restored. These are not negotiable matters. The United States will hold the authorities in Iran fully responsible for the safety of the Americans now held captive. I speak today for hostages who are endangered by the frenzy and uncertainty of events, by the inhumane conditions under which they are held, and by the threat of the authorities in Iran to compound unjust acts through trials. Around the world, nations east and west, north and south, in individual and collective statements have expressed their opposition to this violation of international law. and called for the immediate release of the hostages. We express our appreciation for this overwhelming expression of international concern and support in behalf of the principles that lie at the draft of civilized international behavior. In this spirit, the United States appreciates the fact that the President of the Security Council, speaking on behalf of members of this body, has twice urgently appealed for the release of the hostages. The President of the General Assembly has twice spoken eloquently in support of this plea. The Secretary General of the United Nations has worked unceasingly to resolve this crisis. There has not been, to date, a satisfactory response, and the hostages are still not free. We gather here to determine what more can be done. None of us is deaf to the passionate voices that speak of injustice, that cry out against past wrongs, and that ask for understanding. There is not a single grievance alleged or spoken in this situation that could not be heard in an appropriate forum. In addition, as we have said from the beginning, the United States remains ready, upon the release of the hostages, to discuss with the Iranian authorities the differences which exist between us and to seek their resolution. But no country can call for justice while at the same time denying it to the defenseless. No country can breach the most fundamental rules of the community of nations and at the same time expect that community to be helpful in the problems which it perceives for itself. In the simplest terms, no country can break and ignore the law while seeking its benefits. What is it that the world can agree upon, if not the protection and respect for those whom we appoint to represent our sovereignty and resolve our differences? How tragic for Iran, how tragic for the world, that the threats to peace are being driven to a new crescendo. The most powerful voices in Iran have encouraged violence in neighboring countries and condoned bloodshed rather than condemning it. In addition, totally unfounded charges, which can only inflame the situation, have been made against the United States with respect to the current crisis. The United States, in all the years of its history, has had a fundamental principle, the freedom of all people to worship as they choose. Out of this history and long association, we honor and respect the leaders and the nation of Islam. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations is both a tenet of the United Nations and of the foreign policy of the United States, and that includes, of course, respect for the territorial integrity, political independence, and sovereignty of Iran. We respect the right of the people of Iran to determine their own future through institutions of their own choosing, and all of us must accept their decisions. The President of the United States, speaking for a unified and determined nation, has made it clear that we are seeking a peaceful resolution in this conflict. And so, in this spirit, in an effort to heal wounds of the past, the United States has turned to the Security Council and the General Assembly. In this spirit, the United States has begun proceedings in the International Court of Justice. There is in the United States a unity of purpose, a disciplined sensitivity to the to the needs of peace, a determination to search out for a peaceful means to bring this dispute to a just conclusion, and also a determination to do what must be done to protect our fellow citizens and the rule of law. That unity of purpose is shared by all Americans. But make no mistake, beneath that discipline is a seething anger which Americans properly feel as they witness on daily television new threats and outrages against our fellow citizens. Mr. President, the hostages must be freed. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. The next speaker inscribed on my list is the representative of Norway, to whom I give the floor.
Mr. President, the Norwegian government welcomes and fully supports the Secretary General's request for this urgent meeting of the Security Council. We share his concern over the grave situation. We want to pay tribute to the Secretary General for his tireless efforts to secure the release of the hostages and to defuse the crisis. It is the firm view of the Norwegian government that the hostages in Iran must be released without delay. The taking of hostages, for whatever purpose, is totally unacceptable and must be rejected. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran and the holding of its personnel as hostages amount to flagrant violations of some of the basic rules of international law enshrined in the Vienna Convention of 1961 relating to diplomatic relations and to which Iran is a party. This view was clearly expressed in the declaration made by the President of the Security Council on behalf of the members of the Council on November 9th. It was strongly reiterated on November 27, 1979. It is now high time that the Iranian authorities comply with these repeated appeals. It is incumbent on the Council as a whole to assist constructively in the search for a peaceful solution to the problem, in conformity with the principles of justice and international law. However, the Council can only proceed with its consideration of other aspects of this matter after the government of Iran has complied with the appeals of the Council. Norway pays tribute to the President of the United States of America for the courageous and mature leadership he has provided to his nation at a time when it has been put to a severe test. His deep commitment to finding a peaceful solution has our full support. The United States can, in its demand for the release of the hostages, rely upon the support of the world community. The action by the Iranian students, condoned by the Iranian authorities, is a challenge not only to the United States, but to all of us, as we have a common stake in the inviolability of the basic principles of international law, which must govern relations between nations. In conclusion, Mr. President, I have been authorized by the governments of the other Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, to state that they join us at this meeting of the Security Council in our deep concern over the fate of the U.S. diplomatic personnel held hostage in Tehran, in violation of international treaties and norms of international conduct respected by the community of nations through ages. They, too, give their firm support to the action taken by the Secretary General and to the appeals issued by the President of the Security Council, demanding the immediate release of and a safe return to their homeland of the hostages. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Norway for his statement. The next speaker inscribed on my list is the representative of Portugal, to whom I give the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to begin by expressing to the Secretary General the deepest appreciation of the Portuguese delegation for his relentless efforts in trying to find solutions to the most grave situation we are gathered here to examine, and which has prompted him to ask for the convening of this meeting. Mr. President, the assault on the United States Embassy in Tehran, the taking as hostages of the American diplomatic personnel, and above all, the approval of those acts by the Iranian leaders constitute, in the view of the Portuguese government, a violation not only of the most elementary human rights, but also of the basic principles of international law, which are vital for organizations like the United Nations. We are told by the Iranian leaders that the hostages have not been and are not being ill-treated. We most earnestly hope so. The mere fact of their having been deprived of their freedom during 4 long weeks under degrading conditions, and of their not being allowed to communicate with the outside world, is by itself an inexcusable form of cruel and inhuman treatment. Mr. President, in any country, the rule of law is the best defense of ordinary people against oppression and tyranny. Similarly, between states, international law is the only defense of the small, poor, and weak countries against the rich and the powerful. As the United Nations organ primarily responsible for maintaining peace and security, this Council has the duty of uncompromisingly defending and upholding international law and the principles and procedures that allow for peaceful solution of conflicts. The system of international relations is a painstakingly built edifice of which diplomatic communities are an essential pillar. As the Portuguese government made it clear in its statement issued on the 20th of last month, I quote, "The violation of diplomatic immunities represent a serious breach of the norms governing relations between states, which nothing can legitimize or justify. These principles constitute the main thrust of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, as well as of the New York Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against International Protected Persons, instruments to which Iran is a party," unquote. The accepted rules of diplomatic practice, the statute of immunity that all nations of the world have agreed to grant reciprocally to their diplomatic personnel, are indeed the sine qua non condition both for peaceful coexistence between states and for rational discussion of existing differences. Without them, the whole fabric of international relations would become impossible, and we would not be able to sit around this very table. It is precisely because the violation of these rules threatens, at an essential level, the possibility of a peaceful dialogue between states with different social and political structures, often with opposing interests, or even in a situation of open conflict, that this violation constitutes such a serious threat to peace and to security. Mr. President, if the letter recently addressed to the Secretary General of the United Nations by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran is still to be taken as expressing the point of view of the Iranian leaders, it would seem that Iran wishes to see this Council analyze the responsibilities of the former ruler of that country and that of its supporters at home and abroad for the situation in that country today. It is, of course, the right of every member of the United Nations to bring to the attentions of this Council any issue considered as falling under its competence. But my delegation thinks that we should not lose sight of a few relevant facts. The first is that the writing of past history does not seem to fall under the competence of this Council. The second is that it is doubtful whether this Council is competent to pass judgment over deposed regimes. And the third, and most obvious, is that the threat to peace and security, which has forced us to meet as a reason from the taking and detention of American diplomatic hostages in Tehran a month ago, and not from the events which may have led to this detention. This is why, in the opinion of the Portuguese delegation, before any discussion can be held about past circumstances that may have led to the present crisis, that threat must be removed. That is, these hostages should be released. Then, and only then, will the international community be able to dedicate all its attention to the issues raised by Iran, both before the competent organs of the United Nations and all other appropriate international bodies. States wishing to avail themselves of the United Nations machinery must abide by the fundamental rule of international law. If they fail to respect those principles and the commitments undertaken through the agreements they have subscribed, they lose all moral authority to level accusations at others. Mr. President, the Portuguese delegation deeply regrets the decision of Iran not to participate in this meeting, which was adjourned a week ago precisely to allow it to be present. Nevertheless, we hope that the present leaders of Iran will heed all the appeals addressed to them for the immediate release of the diplomats who lived in Iran, relying in good faith on the protection of their hosts. That, and that only, no matter what grievances Iran might feel against the United States of America, will be in keeping with the honorable traditions of Iranian culture and with the basic principles of justice embodied in Islam. Before concluding, Mr. President, I would like to express the personal solidarity of all members of the Portuguese delegation to our colleagues detained in Iran, who at this moment are certainly hoping that all their fellow diplomats, wherever they may be around the world, are trying their utmost to secure their release and the regaining of their freedom and their dignity. I thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of Czechoslovakia for his statement. Now, I would like to make a statement on behalf of the Chinese delegation. First of all, the Chinese delegation would like to express its appreciation for the initiative taken by the Secretary General on the relations between Iran and the United States. The Chinese government is concerned about recent events in the relations between Iran and the United States. We always hold that the internal affairs of each country should be managed by its own people and that there should be no interference in the internal affairs of other countries. But at the same time, we hold that the principles guiding international relations and the accepted diplomatic immunities should be universally respected. We support the appeal issued by the President of the previous month on behalf of the Council on the immediate release of the detained American hostages in Iran. We sincerely hope that a reasonable and appropriate solution to these events can be found at an early date through peaceful consultation in accordance with principles of international law and diplomatic practice. Now, I will resume my capacity as President of the Council. The next speaker on my list is the representative of Liberia. I invite him to take a seat at the Council table. I give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Mr. President, permit me at the outset to extend congratulations to you, as most befittingly your great country, China, assumes the presidency of the Security Council for this closing month of the final year of a tumultuous decade. I am grateful to you and the other members of the Council for affording Liberia, whose President, Dr. William R. Talbot Jr., is the current chairman of the Organization of African Unity, the honor and high responsibility of taking part in this historic debate tonight. Mr. President, as the Security Council meets, the eyes of the world are fixed upon its deliberations, perhaps as never before. Many grave threats to the peace of the world have claimed this Council's attention in the past, and doubtless graver ones will do so in the future. But tonight, the danger which the whole world faces is more than an ordinary threat to the peace. What we face is nothing short of the catastrophe that the very process by which peaceful intercourse among nations is possible and takes place may be damaged irreparably. As this awareness has grown, it has become recognized in every country, without exception, that what is involved in this crisis is more than a serious dispute between two states, each with credible claims. What, even more importantly, is at stake is the protection of the vital diplomatic process, whose impairment would have the most far-reaching and disastrous consequences for the future of mankind. The actions and decisions of the Security Council are always of great significance, but particular significance surrounds this meeting tonight because this session reaffirms the motivations that give birth to the United Nations itself, namely the conviction that in this modern world, when the grave issues of war or peace are in the balance, rational man ultimately has no choice but to rely not on the power of arms, but on the force of reason. Thus, in response to the statesmanlike and wise request by the Secretary General, pursuant to Article 99 of the Charter, the Security Council has convened this meeting, which could very well be described as a town meeting of the world, and for which the Security Council and the Secretary General have earned the gratitude of all nations. Through many centuries, Mr. President, intercourse among states have primarily taken two forms: a state of war and a state of peace. In war, the nations have relied on soldiers. In peace, on diplomats. But civilized man, by definition, has always preferred the ways of peace to those of wars. Wars, in fact, ensued only because or when diplomacy had failed. Therefore, since diplomacy played so vital a role in the safeguarding of peace, the inviolability and protection of the diplomatic process, its persons and property, have been recognized and respected since ancient times and in all cultures. Since the birth of the United Nations, dedicated as it is to the prohibition of war and the preservation of peace, the role of the diplomat in international relations, and consequently the protection of the diplomatic process, assumed greater importance. This importance found concrete expression in at least 3 major international conventions: the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against internationally protected persons, including diplomatic agents. All of these international conventions reaffirm the principles of customary international law, hoary with age, that diplomatic agents are to be kept inviolate from any form of arrest or detention, that they are absolutely immune from the criminal jurisdiction of the receiving state, that they must be treated with due respect and protected from any attack on their person, freedom, or dignity. The premises, archives, and documents of diplomatic establishments are likewise inviolate under international law, and states are obligated to cooperate in the prevention of crimes against diplomatic officials, premises, and staff. As a lawyer, I would delight in an opportunity to elaborate on the principles of international law to which I have referred. But we are not in a court of law. Moreover, the Council, speaking unanimously through its President several times in recent days, has already placed itself squarely on record in support of the cardinal principles of international law which are at stake in this crisis. The appeal, therefore, which Liberia makes here tonight, although supported, Mr. President, by international law and practice, is based and is offered on humanitarian considerations and a deep concern for the peace of the world. It is the earnest and abiding desire of the current chairman of the Organization of African Unity to assist worthy endeavors in the interest of peace within our own region of West Africa and throughout Africa. His exertions in the cause of peace are widely known and respected. Thus, it was no surprise that in the early days of this crisis, he addressed the following telegraphic message to the Iranian leader, which, with the Council's permission, I have the honor to read. Quote, Ayatollah Khomeini, head of state and religious leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Tehran, Iran. In the name of Allah, I greet you, and wish to register our appreciation for the action taken by you in the release of 2 Marines and 1 female secretary from among the hostages being held at the United States Embassy in Tehran. It was because of our deep humanitarian concern for those who are being held in confinement that we addressed an earlier message to you appealing for their release so as to avoid a heightening of tension in the world which could disturb international peace and security. We maintain the view that the holding of hostages will not redress any wrongs which may have been committed against the people of Iran in the past, nor do we believe that the trial of diplomats in violation of all principles of international law will bring to the people of Iran the justice which they feel is their entitlement. For these reasons, and our respect for the life and dignity of the human person, we again fervently appeal that as a great gesture of grace, you will intercede for the release of all of the hostages, regardless of race, sex, or creed. Such an act, I assure you, Ayatollah, will not only be pleasing in the sight of Allah, the merciful and compassionate, but will also enhance the image and respect of your great country and its people. Let me reassure you that in making this appeal, I do so with no intention whatsoever of interfering in the internal affairs of your country. Please accept the assurances of my highest esteem. Sincerely signed, William R. Talbot, Jr., President of Liberia and current Chairman of the Organization of African Unity, unquote. A few days later, when some more hostages were released, the current Chairman of the OAU sent the following message to the Iranian leader, quote, "In the name of Allah the Merciful, I again greet you as I convey our deep appreciation for the gesture of Islamic clemency you have demonstrated in the release of the 10 other hostages from among those being held at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. The joy which has come to so many from the release of the 13 hostages on yesterday and today will achieve greater proportions as the hearts of so many more will be gladdened when news is given that as a further manifestation of Islamic clemency, you would have caused the release of the remaining hostages being held in Tehran. As we have mentioned in an earlier message to you, such a gesture of grace can only enhance the image and respect of your great country and people. Please accept the assurances of my highest consideration and esteem. Sincerely signed, William R. Talbot, Jr., President of the Republic of Liberia and current Chairman of the Organization of African Unity," unquote. Mr. President, history teaches, and the whole world knows, that no people anywhere have suffered greater abuses, injustice, and exploitation than have the people of Africa. In spite of this, the states and the peoples of Africa have always sought and still seek to redress their grievances by law and through a peaceful process. By legal means and largely through a peaceful process, within less than a generation, we Africans have achieved virtually the total decolonization of our continent. At this very moment, success seems imminent in London for African leaders from Zimbabwe, who even while their forces approach the threshold of victory in a costly and cruel war of liberation, opted for a negotiated path to the resolution of their conflicts. But this is not to say that we Africans are satisfied with our condition in this world. We realize that the international system, in many respects, in the area of law, in economics, as pertains to basic demands of justice, is far from perfect. But progress and justice are possible, and we shall persevere. The challenge of our era in Africa and throughout the world during this nuclear age is to improve international relations while there is still time. If so laudable and desirable a goal is ever to be achieved, there can be no doubt that safe and protected contacts among and between states are indispensable preconditions. If, God forbid, as we are about to enter the 1980s, the world is allowed to become an unsafe place for diplomats to pursue their noble calling, the dark, barbaric world in which mankind would quickly become engulfed, would be too dangerous to contemplate. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for his statement and for his kind words addressed to me. I invite him to resume the seat reserved for him at the side of the council chamber. I should like to inform members of the council that I've just received a letter from the representative of Zaire, in which he requests to be invited to participate in the council's discussion of the item on the agenda. In accordance with the usual practice, I propose, with the consent of the council, to invite that representative to participate in the discussion without the right to vote, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Charter and Rule 37 of the council's provisional rules of procedure. There being no objection, it is so decided. I invite the representative of Zaire to take a seat at the council table in order to make a statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Zaire.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank you, Mr. President.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais
Mr.
tout d'abord
President, first of all,
vous présenter mes très sincères
may I most
félicitations
sincerely
à
congratulate
l'occasion
you
de votre accession
on
à
your
la
accession to the
présidence du Conseil
presidency of the Security Council for the month of December of 1979.
La République du
The
Zaïre,
Republic of Zaire rejoices on seeing you as President of the Security
le
Council.
représentant de la
You,
Chine,
the representative of China,
pays qui est
a
une
country
puissance,
which is a great power and which at the same time
partage tant de choses,
shares so many
préoccupations
things and so many
avec l'ensemble
concerns
des États du tiers-monde,
with all of the
un
states
pays
of
qui
the
n'a cessé
third
d'apporter son
world,
soutien
a country which
à
has
toutes les actions
never ceased to support all the just actions and causes both of the Organization of African Unity as well as of the movement of the non-aligned countries. Mr. President, I also wish most sincerely to congratulate the outgoing President of the Council, His Excellency the Ambassador of Bolivia, for the skillful and wise manner in which he guided the work of the Council and also for the efforts he has made in this delicate affair. Mr. President, this meeting of the Security Council, the Council, which under the United Nations Charter has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is held at a particularly crucial moment in the evolution of international relations. From the north to the south, from the east to the west of the world, to the Security Council converge multiple appeals, one more anxious than the other, all aroused by the troubles and turbulences of this era of transition. The world certainly seeks peace and security, effective guarantees against the insecurity which threatens us from all sides, which threatens our survival, progress and cooperation among nations and peoples and confidence. Mr. President, everyone is aware, every responsible person who observes the situation knows that the situation created in the world because of the taking of hostages in Iran of persons whose inviolability is covered by diplomatic immunity, which is guaranteed and protected by international instruments which are recognized and existing on the subject, bear themselves the seeds of incalculable grave consequences and catastrophic for the future of confident international relations, peace and security for all. While we fully respect the independence of Iran, its sovereignty and all its rights, including the right of its people freely to determine its future, we share the anguish and anxiety not only of the families plunged into deadly uncertainty, who for weeks have been awaiting the return of their relatives, but also that of all those who are responsible throughout the world, of all those strict consciences in the world who want on the future of relations and cooperation among states if such acts are to be accepted or tolerated. We therefore sincerely call on those responsible for Iran fully to respect as the
Session. Here's UN correspondent Lou Chiaffi.
The United States was going to present its own resolution, but was convinced the...
Well, we are apparently having some problem, in any case, with the technical part of our program, and if we get that corrected, we'll try to resume and go back live to the United Nations. In the meantime, in any case, it is the first session of the Security Council of the United Nations on the crisis in Iran. It lasted almost 2 hours, and we heard speakers or statements from 14 nations thus far. We have David Schoenbrunn with us. We're going to at least raise or discuss some of the issues that were raised by some of the 14 nations that spoke tonight, David. It seemed to me that overall there was a unanimous support from countries that are neutral, countries that are adversaries, but all unanimously supporting the United States position tonight. What was your impression?
Oh, quite definitely. There were a couple of nuances, and some people always had an axe of their own that they wanted to hone up. But by and large, it was really fulsome support from around the world for the United States, from Europe, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia.
We, of particular interest in the United States anyway, were interested in the remarks by our United States ambassador, Donald McHenry. What about his remarks?
Well, he reiterated the policy statements that President Carter had laid down, and he did so very forcefully, and it was really quite impressive. He recalled what had been said previously, but said it very well, that in the darkest moments of conflicts between nations, the immunity of envoys has always been respected in world history. But Iran is violating that most basic obligation of nations. He then pointed out the irony of the fact that they are holding hostage the very people whose mission it is to establish communications with other countries, the very people who could negotiate the grievances that Iran says they have are the people that they're holding hostage. They're therefore blocking themselves. Mr. McHenry pointed out that he insists, he didn't appeal, he didn't ask, he demanded, insists was the word he used, that our personnel be released and our premises restored, and he said solemnly, this is not negotiable. The government of Iran, he said, as the president said, will be held responsible for its acts. He then went on to temper his remarks by saying that we are sensitive to the grievances that the people of Iran may have. But he pointed out that these grievances can be heard in appropriate forums. We are ready, he said, we of the United States are ready to discuss our differences with Iran. But, Mr. McHenry pointed out, no country can call for justice while denying it to individuals. No country can breach the law and ask to benefit from the law. He went on to say, and this is quite important, that freedom of worship is a fundamental principle of the American Democratic Republic. We honor, we respect Islam, as we do all religions. We respect the rights of the people of Iran to choose their own system of government. And we are seeking a peaceful solution to this conflict. We've already begun proceedings in the International Court of Justice, at the General Assembly, at the Security. We've done absolutely everything. And Mr. McHenry said there is a unity of purpose in this country. But then came a solemn warning. I'll quote his words. There is a seething anger below the surface in the hearts and guts of the American people. And he said these hostages must be freed. It was a strong statement from our ambassador, Steve.
David, one of the things that I've noticed in any case was that most of the speakers from the member nations echoed a lot of what Ambassador McHenry said, yet I'm sure you must have picked up some important distinctions there.
There were some important distinctions and interesting ones. One came from Portugal. Portugal pointed out that this is not just a conflict with a great power like the United States, but that the principle of the inviolability of diplomatic envoys is a principle of law which has been put there to protect small nations, to protect poor nations and weak nations. And every poor, weak nation in the world is endangered tonight because of what Iran has done. That was an interesting point from Portugal. Then there was another one from Gabon, which struck me. He was the only one who struck this note, the ambassador from Gabon, because he referred to the Islamic religion and to the Quran. And he said, even under Islamic law, there is a provision for the respect of all envoys, including non-Muslim envoys. That was an interesting note. I also saw with myself some irony and listened to the representative of the Soviet Union piously declaring that the Soviet Union respects the rights of all peoples and doesn't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, while sitting next to delegates from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland, and other countries in which Russia has interfered. But I'd like to point out to the American public something very interesting that most people have forgotten if they ever knew it. The very first major interference in the rights and independence and integrity of Iran came from Russia.
Yes.
1945, they set up a puppet communist regime in Azerbaijan, and they were driven out after a Security Council meeting by a very feisty American president, Harry Truman, who said, get out, and they got out.
Listen, I should mention at this point that we did have some technical difficulties with our feed from the United Nations, but apparently we really didn't miss much of anything. That session has adjourned. One thing I want to ask you. Many citizens in the United States particularly express no confidence in the United Nations as a body. Now, when we listen to the members speak, they are speaking a diplomatic language which the average person really doesn't understand. What would you say to them? What has the UN done tonight?
Well, the UN has offered, at least in words, support for the American demand, but I think the American people would be right to still be a little mistrustful, because most of them didn't use the word demand. Most of the ambassadors used the word appeal. They're still appealing to Iran. The time has come to stop appealing to Iran and tell Iran what to do. I think what the American people really expect, and what may decide the future of the United Nations itself, is whether all these speeches are over tonight, tomorrow night, maybe even Monday for all I know, will they take some kind of action? It's one thing to call for respect for international law. It's another thing to apply international law. Will there be a resolution demanding that Iran free the hostages? And if Iran doesn't do that, will the United Nations, which it can do, apply sanctions and tell all the peoples of the world and countries of the world not to deal with Iran? Will they expel Iran from the United Nations? This is what the people of the United States are looking for and waiting for.
David, I have two items here that I'm going to read, the second one of which I want you to comment on in just a moment. The first being that the Secretary General Kurt Waldheim told reporters that he has received renewed assurances from Iran that the American hostages in Tehran were safe and that they are protected. He said he received that assurance through the Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka, who talked with Iran's new foreign minister yesterday and flew to New York today. The second item, this is the eve of a very important referendum in Iran. Citizens are voting on the Ayatollah Khomeini's new Islamic constitution, and there are about, I'm told, according to this UPI copy, about 20 opposition groups are boycotting that referendum. And the report goes on to say that they are reaching Tehran. These reports indicate, reaching Tehran indicate that in one city, about 250 people destroyed ballot boxes and took the local governor hostage. Even so, Khomeini appears assured of a large voter turnout. Now, what does that suggest to you?
Well, I think it reflects what we all know has been happening, and that Iran is living through a period of anarchy. The Ayatollah Khomeini is a kind of a spiritual and emotional image for a great many Iranians, but obviously not for all Iranians. There are a number of ethnic groups which living in Iran who are not Persian, not Farsi. There are Kurds, there are Turkmens of all kinds. The Kurds would like to be free. There are also 60,000 mullahs who are not all of them loyal to the Ayatollah Khomeini. There are other Ayatollahs who have ambitions of their own.
Most of the power is in the mullahs?
Yeah, in the mullahs. And you see what's so interesting, you're quite right to bring this up, Steve. These mullahs are all through the countryside, not just in Tehran. They may form as many as 5,000, 6,000 individual power centers. We don't know who really controls Iran. It certainly isn't Khomeini himself. The Revolutionary Council has great strength, to be sure, but that country is fragmented, living in anarchy, and that's another reason why it's so very difficult to deal with them.
Well, in light of this report, then, and the voting, does this put any kind of extra pressure on the UN?
Possibly. I think that the pressure on the UN, no matter what else happens, is that the UN, even more than the United States, has been defied by a member country which has broken the most sacred and ancient of traditions, and the UN, as Senator Church said today, is on trial.
Okay. Thank you. We, as always, welcome your unique perspective.
Thank you.
Now, one of our Action News reporters, Jeff Kamen, has spent a lot of time at the United Nations during this Iranian crisis. We've had reports with particular interest on the Secretary General, Kurt Waldheim. His report tonight will include him and the Congressional delegation that came to the UN tonight. Jeff?
Steve, 5 members of Congress were at the UN Security Council tonight, among them the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committees in both the House and the Senate. Frank Church, the Idaho Democrat who runs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was asked at a news conference if he thinks the Security Council's deliberations will ultimately turn out to be nothing but a waste of time. Here's how he answered that question.
I would certainly hope that that does not prove to be the case. The facts are that the United Nations is anything but an instrumentality of the United States. And even the most cursory examination of the votes that have been taken in the United Nations in the past few years on any number of issues will bear me out. The UN is no tool of the United States, but the world community has an interest in the preservation of peace. And I think for that reason, since it was for such a purpose that the United Nations was established in the first place, that the UN itself is on trial as to its effectiveness. And that too must be taken into account by the Security Council and by the General Assembly and by all those who have membership in this organization. The UN, in a sense, is on trial.
And so Secretary General of the United Nations Kurt Waldheim is clearly the man on the international diplomatic hotspot tonight, and he knows it. Steve?
We would like to thank United Nations Television for their help in the transmission of the live broadcast from the Security Council chambers tonight. And with that, we will conclude our special coverage of the United Nations Security Council special meeting on Iran. I'm Steve Bosch. Have a good night.